Welcome to episode 16 of a journey through Papua New Guinea history. My name is Eric Johns. For many years, I have researched and written about the history of Papua New Guinea. This series draws on that work. In this episode, we will be looking at three remarkable women from the past, women whose names and stories unusually have survived in the historical record. One of the unfortunate features of early books about Papua New Guinea is how rarely individual Papua New Guineans are named. The books often contain many photographs of local people, but the captions usually identify them only by their village, district or ethnic group. This photograph is a typical example. The caption simply describes the subject as a cuckoo from the Papua River. We are given a striking image of an individual, but his name, and therefore something of his personal identity, has been lost to history. The same is true of this photograph. We are told only that he was a Watut River man, another individual whose face was recorded, but whose name was not. This was especially true of women. Although early books contain many photographs of Papua New Guinean women, their names were seldom recorded. Even well into the 20th century, it can be surprisingly difficult to discover much about individual women and their lives. There were, however, some exceptions, women whose names and stories did find their way into historical writing. This episode tells the stories of three of them, Kaloka Naimi, Kori Taboro and Alice Wadega. Their very different lives take us from traditional leadership in the early colonial period to the gradual emergence of Papua New Guinean women into education, leadership and modern public life. The first of these women takes us back to the early years of European contact in New Guinea. Her name was Kaloka Naimi, although Europeans who met her usually called her Queen Kaloka. The photographer of this picture and the date it was taken are unknown. It shows a young Kaloka with her husband boy. It might have been taken somewhere around the year 1884, about the time the British raised their flag at Port Moresby. By then she was already a fully recognised prominent female chief. Kaloka was from Nara village, not far from Delena on the south coast of Papua. She came from a chiefly family and following the death of her father became recognised as his successor. A woman holding this position of authority was unusual enough in the eyes of Europeans to attract their attention. One of those who wrote about her was the missionary Henry Dauncey. He described Kaloka as the only woman he knew who was recognised as the head of a village. Other Europeans who travelled through this part of Papua also met her. Among them were the explorer Luigi d'Albertus and the missionary James Chalmers. Here we see Kaloka as an older woman. This picture was taken by the missionary Dauncey around 1910. What is important is that Kaloka's authority was recognised by her own people. Her story, therefore, gives us a glimpse of something that colonial accounts often overlooked. Women could hold positions of considerable standing and influence within traditional Papua New Guinean societies. And unlike the many anonymous women who appear in photographs from this period, Kaloka's name survived. Our second woman, Kori Taboro, lived in a very different setting. She was probably born around the year 1860. She was a Khoitar woman from Pari village in the Port Moresby area. By the early 20th century, Port Moresby was changing rapidly. Europeans had established their town there, missionaries were active, and traditional Khoitar and Motu communities were increasingly being drawn into the colonial world. Kori was known as a diviner who could identify certain illnesses and calamities as having specific causes often related to spiritual or ancestral matters. She was schooled by the London Missionary Society but maintained her traditional cultural practices while engaging with the colonial Australians and the missionaries. Kori was also an important keeper of traditional knowledge. She was married to Ikau Serai, and in 1930 the two of them erected a traditional tabudubu at Hanuabara village. This picture shows another tabudubu that was erected in Hanuabara at the same time. Corey's involvement demonstrated that despite decades of missionary and colonial influence, she remained deeply involved in Motu Koita cultural life. But the main reason we remember Corey today is something special that she did towards the end of her life. In 1946, inside the home of geologist G.A.V. Stanley, she dictated an account of the history of her people. It was recorded in the Motu language by a clerk from the education department named Sinaka Goava. He wrote down her words in a journal. Sinaka Goava himself would later become a significant figure. He was one of the group of young elite associated with the famous Bully Beef Club, the discussion group of students and public servants from which several important figures in the movement towards independence emerged in the 1960s. But on this occasion, his job was to preserve the words of an elderly Koita woman. The resulting account became known as Kori Taboro Ena Sivarai, the story told by Kori Taboro. It was later, in 1979, published in the journal called Oral History. What is particularly interesting is that Corey did not tell a story in the way we might expect someone today to write an autobiography. She said surprisingly little about herself. Instead, she talked about her people. She told of migrations and warfare. She spoke about ancestors and traditional events and about the coming of the missionaries and the colonial government. She was passing on the history that she believed she had the authority to tell. In Motu Koita tradition, genealogy and ancestral connections could give a person the right, the siahu, to preserve and pass on particular histories. That makes Corey's account especially valuable. Much of the early history of Papua New Guinea was written by outsiders in books like these by explorers, missionaries, government officers, traders and travellers. Corey's story allows us to hear something different. A Papua New Guinean woman telling the history of her own people from within their own tradition. Corey died at Hanuabad on the 18th of March 1950. Her story gives us a rare glimpse of the Motu Koita world during a period of enormous change. Through her, we can see that the coming of missions and colonial government did not simply sweep the old culture away. People adapted. They accepted some new ideas while retaining others. They moved between the old world and the new. Corey could attend a mission school and still practice as a traditional diviner. She could live under Australian colonial rule and still take part with her husband in building a tabu dubu. And late in her life, she could pass on the histories that had been entrusted to her. That is what makes Kori Taboro particularly important. At a time when Papua New Guinean women were very rarely named in the written records, Corey did something more than have her name recorded. She left us the story of her people. We know much more about the third woman who takes our story into a new period of history. Her name is Alice Wedega, and she was the first Papua New Guinean woman to become widely known, both inside and outside of her own country. In fact, she could claim many firsts. She was also the first Papua New Guinean woman to hold a seat in the Legislative Council, the first to be decorated, and the first to publish a book. She was born in 1905 at Alo Alo village in Milne Bay, about 60 kilometres southwest of Alatau, the present-day capital of Milne Bay Province. When Alice was 7, her mother sent her to Quarto Island to help care for her aunt's baby. While there, she began attending the mission school established by the LMS missionary Charles Abel. Alice completed primary school, then trained as a teacher at the Quarto Teacher Training School. She began teaching in mission schools and also became involved in evangelistic work. Alice, shown here with other teacher graduates at Quarto, made an important decision that would shape the rest of her life. She decided that she would never marry, but would devote her life to educating and helping her people. In 1935, she joined Cecil Abel and other Quarto evangelists on a remarkable journey from Cloudy Bay to the inland Kevari and Dorowade villages. The government regarded the people of the area as dangerous, but Alice and her companions went among them peacefully and succeeded in establishing Christian influence there. Then came the Second World War. In January 1942, Japanese forces invaded New Britain and New Ireland and began advancing through the islands. In August, they landed at Milne Bay. Most Europeans had already left for Australia, while Alice Widega and other local Kwato missionaries moved to the mainland. There, Alice witnessed some of the fighting that became the Battle of Milne Bay. When the war ended in 1945, Alice returned to the work that had occupied so much of her life. She became principal of the mission school at Amau, near Cloudy Bay, and by the early 1950s, she was one of the most experienced and respected members of the Kwato mission. But her life was about to move far beyond the mission schools of Milne Bay. In 1952, Alice was chosen to represent Papua at the Pan-Pacific Women's Conference in Christchurch, New Zealand. The conference discussed education and issues affecting women throughout the Pacific. Alice became the first Papua New Guinean woman to represent her people at an overseas conference. It was an important turning point. Alice was no longer simply a teacher and missionary from Milne Bay. She was becoming a woman of national importance. More responsibilities followed. In 1953, she became District Commissioner of the Kwato Amau Girl Guides. Later, she joined the Department of Welfare, where much of her work centred on improving the lives of women and families. Alice had become a strong advocate for women. In Milne Bay, she advised women about childcare, health and domestic problems. At Ahioma, she helped establish a centre where women could learn cooking, sewing, hygiene and craft work, as well as how to organise and run their own women's clubs. Then in 1961 came another remarkable achievement. Administrator Donald Cleland invited Alice to become a member of the Legislative Council, which was the government of Papua New Guinea. She accepted, becoming the first Papua New Guinean woman to sit in the council. For a woman born in a small Milne Bay village in 1905 who had begun her education at a mission school on Kwato Island, it was an extraordinary journey. When the Legislative Council was abolished in 1964, Alice returned to welfare and mission work. Later, when serious unrest developed on Bougainville over proposed copper mining, Administrator David Hay asked Alice to go there and help. Her approach was characteristically practical. She did not lecture the women about politics or mining. Instead, she listened to them and looked for ways in which she could help. She persuaded the administration to provide sewing machines and materials and gave dressmaking lessons. She even showed women how to make an oven from a 44-gallon drum that could bake several loaves of bread at the same time. It was a small example of the way Alice had worked throughout her life, helping people through education and practical action. In 1972, she travelled overseas once more with Moral Rearmament, this time to Europe. Moral Rearmament was a recently formed Christian group. After returning home, she finally retired, but there were still important milestones ahead. Alice was delighted when Papua New Guinea became independent in 1975, and especially proud that independence had been achieved peacefully. Her own contribution to the country was increasingly recognised. In 1964, she had been made a member of the Order of the British Empire, the first Papua New Guinean woman to receive the award. In 1981, her autobiography, Listen, My Country, was published. It was the first book published by a Papua New Guinean woman and gave Alice the opportunity to tell, in her own words, the story of the enormous changes she had witnessed. Then, in 1982, came an even greater honour. Alice was made a dame, the first Papua New Guinean woman to receive that distinction. 5 years later, on the 3rd of December 1987, Dame Alice Widega died at Ahioma in Milne Bay. She was given a state funeral and buried at Duria Hamlet in the Ahioma area. Her life had stretched from the colonial world of mission schools and village communities to an independent Papua New Guinea. 3 women, 3 different worlds. Queen Koloka, Kori Tarboro and Alice Wedega lived very different lives. Koloka belonged to a world in which authority came through traditional society and inherited leadership. Kori Tarboro carried the knowledge and memories of that traditional world, and unusually, some of her own words were preserved. Alice Wedega belonged increasingly to the new Papua New Guinea that was emerging during the 20th century, a world of schools, international conferences, public service, and eventually national political life. There must have been many other remarkable Papua New Guinean women during these years, but their names and deeds were either not recorded or have not been brought to light. That is why these three women are important. Their surviving stories allow us to see beyond the anonymous faces in old photographs and catch a glimpse of the lives, achievements and changing roles of women during the colonial period. And that brings us to the end of episode 16. I hope you will join us again as we continue our journey through the remarkable history of Papua New Guinea. It helps if you press the like button, and if you subscribe to the series, you will be notified when the next episode appears.